and gentlemen, you have just heard from side proposition, and I applaud them for their staunch approach to this resolution and how it applies to nations that have access to the internet. But ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree that this definition, this resolution rather, is really nullified in such nations because we know them to be defunct in nations with the internet. We believe this debate hinges upon the nations that do not have the privilege of the internet to move along in society, ladies and gentlemen. The definition of age of the internet being such only applying to nations that have internet capabilities is inappropriate for this debate in our opinion, and we are challenging the definition of this. The nuclear age started between two countries. Even though all the other countries around it did not have nuclear warheads, we were in the nuclear age. And just because a country does not have internet does not mean we are not in the internet age. Ladies and gentlemen, it is this point I'd like to now unpack their case they have propped up against this window of only nations having the internet. I'd like to start off with their first point of it being human nature. Now, of course, while we acknowledge that there is this inherent wish for individuals to look for a better life, there is one thing that was missed on the bench, is that many times these nations believe they have the best life available to them. North Korea is an example. They believe the supreme leader, once Kim Jong-il, now Kim Il Jong-soon, or whatever his name may be, is the supreme one, and that they're living in a veritable paradise. Take it a moment. What we see here is that, ladies and gentlemen, even though they lack the internet, we see that they don't actually want anything better because they believe they have the best situation available to them. So this point is incredibly valid. I agree, sir.
But any individual who sees people starving around them will realize that perhaps they're not living the best life they can have.
Sir, that is to have the outside involvement. You will recall that North Korea does not have the internet to guide them. You will recall that North Korea believes they have the best situation available to them. So as far as we're concerned, there's no reason for them to want to overthrow the government. And there's no reason for them to ever want to see anything better because they believe they do indeed have the best. Now, the next point was on the Arab Spring. I will unpack this pillar in detail in my second point, thus being the illusion that the Arab Spring has brought towards, or the anomaly that the Arab Spring has brought towards. Their second point was unification. And yes, of course, we know the internet does empower citizens. We know the internet has the potential to guide people together into a better life, such as happened in the Arab Spring. But what we forget, ladies and gentlemen, is the following. The internet, as my partner Michael will soon indicate to you, is a scarcity in some of these countries. And as they have chosen to ignore, the countries that are at the forefront of this debate about autocracies are ones where the government has chosen or has not been able to provide the internet. So once again, we see the issue here that has been propped up against side opposition's case. And at this time, I'd like to move in to my constructive speech. Firstly, we have three pillars I'd like to present to you today. They are, namely, examples of countries. Our second is the Arab Spring anomaly. And our third and final is the internet infrastructure required. I will be discussing pillars 1 and 2, and as I alluded to earlier, my partner Michael will discuss the third. Firstly, examples of countries. I think it is worthwhile at this point to look at nations that, in fact, do not have the internet, and those that even do have the internet, and yet autocracy thrives. North Korea, for example, as already brought up, does not have the internet or has an extremely censored form of it. But what we see here is that the government is still thriving. Many African nations also are autocracies. Now, many of these also lack the ability to gain access to the internet. And what we see here is that, once again, whether corrupt or whether not serving the rights of their people, these institutions are still thriving. Two examples I think are particularly interesting are Venezuela and China, both of which do have internet capabilities, but both of which have their government still thriving. So as we see from these examples, even though the internet may or may not be available, even if it is or is not, we see that autocracy is still there. It is still thriving, it is still with us, and it's still something we must take into account. My second point is the Arab Spring anomaly, and I think it is incredibly relevant given the new tensions had over the past several years to discuss it. Now we of course know how several nations, Libya, Tunisia, the leaders were brought down because of the efforts of social media, of its citizens, and the use of the internet. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's worthwhile to point out that this is not the norm in other such countries with autocracies. What we see here is that there was a certain proximity that occurred in the Arab Spring. The flow of ideas was not essentially exclusive to the internet. There was also spillover from people leaving the country and moving around. What's more, we acknowledge that the institutions in place in these Arab countries were weak already before the Arab Spring took over. What's more, we see that oil was incredibly important, and in such, foreign influence was incredibly important. I'll take you in a moment. We also see that because of this foreign influence, and because of different standpoints on this foreign influence by different minority groups, or majority groups if you will, we see that a veritable powder keg was formed in the region, effectively having internet be the spark to the powder keg, and not the ultimate means. Do you not agree, sir?
But we see that internet was the mechanism in which people actually organized riots and protests, which eventually overthrew the government.
Certainly, sir. But what I'm trying to get at here is that even in the internet age, we have other countries, as I talked about, who are still autocratic, and in the Arab Spring movement, the issues with the institutions were in place before internet was there. It was a spark that blew up the keg. We do not believe it's solely because of the internet that autocracy was brought to its knees. And that's what we're trying to get at today. So ladies and gentlemen, what have we talked about today? We've talked about just because a country does not have the capability does not mean the world is in the appropriate age. And on that basis, we challenge the definition of what the internet age is. Additionally, we discussed our first two contentions, namely examples of countries who can't afford or censor their internet heavily, and yet still have autocracy thriving. We also discussed our second pillar of the Arab Spring anomaly, and discussed, while yes, the internet did assist, the issues that were there were present long before the internet was available. So ladies and gentlemen, because of this contention, and the contention that my partner will soon bring up about the practicality of internet infrastructure in these nations, we of side opposition firmly believe this resolution must most definitely